Morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. As you can see, I'm on the Death Star, and I like to do that right before we have an exam because this is about as menacing as I can get. So hopefully you're a little intimidated. Just kidding. Um, anyway, as you know, we have an exam starting midnight tonight. You can take it anytime between midnight tonight and Sunday at midnight. And we can take a couple of seconds and go over the information for the exam. The exam's all ready for you. All the questions are all set up, and I can tell you a little bit more detail now. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. Cool. So, yes, it starts at midnight tonight. If you're so inclined, you can take it at 12:01, or I guess 12 a.m. You can take it anytime, any 90-minute period between now and next and Sunday at midnight. If you do have accommodations, you have been given the extra time. No need to worry about that. That's all set up to go. It is an open book exam, as you know, meaning you can take any of your notes and videos and slides and the book, of course, and use that during the exam. That's no problem. But again, I need to remind you, and I need to emphasize this, that you cannot go into the exam without having studied. There's no way you'll pass because the exam is not designed for that. The exam is designed for you to go in, answer the questions that you've studied for well and you're confident in, and then go back and then check the answers that you have some questions on that you're unsure of. And I believe there's a way, so this is the first time, as I said, I'm using Canvas, but I was looking at the exam. I think there's a way you can go through and actually mark some of the questions that you're unsure of, which makes it very easy. You will get all the questions at the same time, so you can go back and forth. It's not like you have to answer a question and it disappears. We don't do it like that. So you can easily go back and forth on the 60-question exam without a problem. You will end up having, I guess, after today, 18 questions already given to you. So that's almost a third of the questions that you'll already have the answers to. That's ridiculously easy. Rosenblum, what is this, easy summer course or something? Yeah, kind of it is. So that should help you immensely, already having almost a third of the questions completed. It's important, though, that you understand what the answers are to those questions and why they are the answers. That being said, despite the fact it's open book, and despite the fact that you already have a third of the answers to the questions, there are people that struggle on the test if they don't study. So again, I encourage you to study. It's an important part of passing the class. Okay. The exam must be taken alone, as I've been saying. Hopefully that's not going to be a problem. You're going to be taking it when you're ready anyway. Do not be don't contact folks while you're taking the exam. Okay, it covers everything through certainly last class and probably most of today's class. It's everything on taste, and I think I might be able to get to a little touch today, depending on how we pace the class. And if that's the case, you'll know that once we start covering the touch information, that will be covered on the final exam, not on this exam, not on this weekend's exam. That also includes the discussion section material that was covered through last week. As you know from yesterday, the discussion sections covered touch yesterday, and that will be covered again on the final exam, everything through smell and taste, which was covered on last week's sections. That will be on the midterm. Okay. Now I should mention, as I was writing up the exam, working on it, editing it, there are a bunch of book questions in there that are neither covered in lecture or discussion section. And so it is important that you read the book. So again, there is definitely a nice set of questions that have been derived from the book that were neither covered on the lecture material or in the discussion section material. And so it is important to read the book. And I actually italicized it and underlined that here to remind myself to tell you, yeah, there are definitely questions that were not covered in lecture that are in the book. Okay. Oh, also, definitely a couple of questions from the preface. So I think I mentioned this before, but I just wanted to emphasize this again. Yeah, there are 5 formal chapters that you'll be studying for. But again, there are questions derived from the preface. So make sure you read the preface and you understand it. I mean, a lot of the preface just kind of gives a general introduction to the book, but there are things in the preface about why the book could be written when it was that would be a good thing to know for the exam. What had been going on, what's going on in the field that kind of gives rise to being able to write the book when it was. Okay. Cool. Let me take a second here and see if there are questions I can answer about the exam. And you can either chat your question, or you can speak up or raise your hand. Hopefully I'm seeing everybody here. Any questions? Wow, look at my head, kind of keeps changing shape. That's cool. I look like a cone head. Let me see if I can do that again. There I am. That's really menacing. Wow, I look like I belong on the Death Star, don't I? Cool. Anyway, any questions? I'm having fun. Maybe you're nervous about the exam, but I'm having a good time. It should not be hard. This is one of those summer courses that we just want you to really learn, appreciate, be engaged with the material. I wish we didn't have to give exams, but it's important. If you study, you're gonna do really, really well. Questions? No? Okay. If things come up during today's lecture at any time, feel free to chat your question or raise your hand or just speak up. That's no problem. Happy to help in any way. All right. Just want to try. There I am. Hopefully you're seeing that. Hopefully it's going to be on the video too, so I can show my kids how silly I look. Great. Okay. Then let's go ahead and share our screen and continue our lecture on taste. So, what we've been discussing with regard to taste, we introduced the idea of taste perception as being influenced by a lot more than what's on the tongue, right? So, when we have an experience tasting things, cool. We have a sense that our experience is in the mouth, it's on the tongue, but we already know that much of what we taste actually comes through smell. Okay, so you've already seen this slide. I'm just putting this up again real quickly. You've learned that in your class. Your discussion section class. I think I already have this stuff. Yeah. Okay. You have that in your discussion section class. You do that little demonstration, and hopefully it worked well for you. Again, when we do this in live, we have people eat mystery jelly beans. We just put it in their hand with their eyes closed. We have them put it in their mouth while they're holding their nose closed. And we have them chew it and try to guess the flavor. And most people, there are a couple of flavors that you can kind of tell, like mints and licorices and stuff like that. But for the most part, people can just say, I have no idea. It just kind of tastes sugary. Nothing else is going on. And then we say, okay, 1, 2, 3, release your nose. They release their nose. This allows the odorants that are part of the jelly beans flavor to actually get seeped back to the back of the mouth and in through the back of the nose like that. And bam, it's spontaneous. You say, oh my gosh, it's grape. Oh my gosh, it's peach. And again, as we said last class, maybe about 75, 80% of your experience of flavor comes from that. It comes from your sense of smell kind of being integrated with taste. But then we also talked about how the other senses are involved in taste. So we brought up the kind of cool example of these dark restaurants that at least had been advertised as allowing your taste to really experience flavor more vividly because you're not being distracted by seeing things in the restaurant. And it might be true. You're certainly not being distracted by as much, but not being able to see your food has some very serious ramifications for your sense of flavor. And in fact, as the research shows, and as my own experience and the experience of my wife and my friends showed, if you can't see your food, it tastes pretty bland, because vision has an important influence on your experience of taste. And it's a real experience of taste. It's not like, well, I can't see it, it doesn't look pretty, so I don't enjoy it as much. I mean, it really dilutes your sense of flavor. Again, suggesting something about the multisensory aspects of taste. And then finally, even the experience of what you're hearing can influence what you taste. And this had just come out, as I said, right before I was finishing the book. This study came out that showed that you can manipulate what somebody is hearing as they're chewing, and that will influence their sense of how fresh or crisp something is experienced. And people will say in these experiments, yeah, I didn't notice that things changed in sound very much, but I did notice that some of these tasted stale and some of these tasted fresh, where they were always Pringles again and again and again, right? They had an experience of them being different potato chips and different potato chips with different freshness, which is interesting. That all is based on how sound was manipulated as people were chewing. Okay, very cool. The last thing I want to discuss with regard to the multisensory aspects of flavor and taste perception is how our sense of touch influences our sense of taste. So you taste what you touch, as that part of the chapter is entitled. And I have a picture of our tongue there. It's actually an older picture now with the taste bud map on our tongue. Maybe you saw this in discussion section, or you can see it, online. But you can see here that the taste buds are kind of spread unevenly across the tongue. Okay, this is interesting because it's going to kind of really allow us to demonstrate a kind of cool illusion. Sadly, we won't be able to demonstrate it remotely, but I can describe it well enough so you'll understand it. So what is it? Well, most of our sweet taste buds are located up front on the tip, kind of around the tip of the ridge of the tip of the tongue. There's none in the back of the tongue, for example. Where the taste buds that are in back of the tongue are the ones that are detecting bitterness and sourness. Salt is kind of, more towards, those taste buds are more spread towards the middle of the tongue. And that's kind of an interesting setup, actually. There's reasons why that might work. I won't get into that now. But it allows us to kind of demonstrate an interesting phenomena with touch. And that is the following. Imagine having something like a hard candy in your mouth. I don't know what hard candies do you folks eat in your generation. We had something called Lifesavers, or there's other things, Sweet Tarts. Maybe you guys know what those are from Halloween. But other candies that you kind of suck on, you don't chew on, or you suck on for a while and then you chew on when it's almost disappeared. A hard candy, basically. Maybe even a mint that you get at a restaurant or something like that. And you have it sucked, you're sucking on it in your mouth. And if I asked you, where is the flavor? I mean, where is as that's candy, as that hard candy moves around your tongue, where is the flavor coming from? You say, oh, it's coming from the hard candy, clearly, right? So, whether the hard candy is in the front of my mouth or in the back of my mouth, I like to kind of throw it back and forth between my molars because that's fun, right? But wherever that hard candy is, that is experienced as the source of the sweet flavor, for example, the grape flavor or anything like that, right? That is where the flavor is coming from. It's coming from the hard candy, which is kind of weird because imagine it's just sweet we're discussing now, that the sweetness of the hard candy is experienced as coming from the candy itself. But we actually don't have sweet taste buds spread across the tongue for us to be able to experience it that way, right? We only taste sweet in the front of our tongue. So when we're throwing it back and forth with our tongue between our back molars on the right and the left, right? So it's in the back of the tongue. We experience the sweetness as coming from the candy even though there's no sweet taste buds there, back there. And so what happens is kind of an illusion that where food touches your tongue is experienced as where the flavor is coming from, even if we don't have the right sort of cells, the right sort of sensory detectors to detect the sweetness, to detect the flavor of that food. Sorry, I'm a little distracted. My doggy's knocking on the door, he's scratching on the door, but I think he'll finish in just a second. Go away, Max the dog. He's got my son to play with, so he'll go back in there. All right. And that's called the idea that where food touches the tongue allows the flavor to seem to emanate from the food is an illusion called tactile capture. It's kind of a hard, a new term, tactile capture. Tactile just means touch. Okay, that's all it means. Where is the food touching the tongue? Capture means that the flavor is captured where that occurs, where the hard candy is touching the tongue. Even though we don't have any sensory organs to detect sweetness in the back of the tongue, it seems that the sweetness is coming from the candy. So it's kind of an illusion. Where the candy touches the tongue, that's where we experience sweetness, even if we've got no sensor. So here's my tongue here. Is this coming out okay? Yeah. Here's my tongue. There we go. Yeah, let's do it this way. There's my tongue. The candy you put the candy in your mouth, okay, and it does, get detected as sweet because, it goes past the front of your tongue and there is, saliva that has some sweetness in it, right, as we're sucking it. But the candy's back here and you're kind of, throwing it back and forth between your molars or whatever back here. There's no way to detect sweet back here. But, okay, we do experience sweet staying with the location of the candy. So where your tongue is being touched is an illusion about where the flavor is coming from, because you'd have to taste sweet back here. Okay? And so the most obvious, and we do this in class, and the hard candy demonstration works really well. People say, yeah, there's no question. I don't have any, even if I don't have any sweet taste buds back there, I am experiencing sweet back there where I'm being touched by the candy. There's even more dramatic ways, and we used to do this in class. It got a little messy, but I think you'll appreciate a description of the demonstration, even if you're not able to do it yourself. Okay, it's called let me describe it. Well, yeah, you can put it down. The sweet tongue illusion. Here's how it works. Pretend you didn't see this map yet, right? This map of how the taste buds are kind of spread across the tongue. Let's pretend you haven't seen that yet and you don't know that we have sweet taste buds in front and salty in the middle and bitter and sour in the back. Let's just pretend that you don't know how that's spread out. And I say, let's map out where the taste buds are. Okay, let's map out where the taste buds are. So this is what I have you do. I have you take a Q-tip and dip it in sugar water. I say, okay, let's all start with sticking out our tongue and putting it on the side of our tongues. Okay, so they do that. Everyone does that. They stick out their tongue like that. And they take their Q-tip and they put it on their side of their tongue and say, it's sugar water, so let's find out where your sweet taste buds live. Cool. And what they do is they start on the side and you try to now determine whether you could taste sweet on the side. And the answer is going to be no when you do that. So no, I don't want to get too gross here, but I'm touching just the side of the kind of the main part of the tongue here. I'm just touching right here on the side. Oh, I'm having trouble. Yeah, right there. I'm kind of bringing slowly the Q-tip around to the front. No, I don't taste sweet yet. I don't taste sweet. No. Aha! I now taste sweet. So maybe I ask you to take a draw. I give you a drawing of the tongue, and now you can map out. You can say these are the sweet taste buds here. Say, okay, let's continue around the other side of the tongue to see if there's sweet taste buds over there. And you say, oh yeah, absolutely. There are sweet taste buds here because I continue to taste sweet all along the opposite ridge. which is kind of weird. It's kind of an asymmetric map, but it looks like, from the, from our perspective, looking at the tongue, that for some reason there are taste buds for sweet in front and on the left side of the tongue as we're looking at it. Okay, as an observer, I'm just calling this the left. It's obviously, I'm sorry, yeah, it'd be the right. It'd be the right from the observer, the left from the person with the tongue. Right. Okay. All right. So the left side of the person's tongue. Say, okay. So I have sweet taste buds in the front and on my left, which is a little odd because you wouldn't expect it to be so asymmetric, but cool. So I just made a little map. Say, okay, have a glass of water now that doesn't have sugar in it. And then, rinse your mouth out really well, and we'll try it again, but we'll just kind of confirm that, in fact, it is the left side of your tongue, okay, like the ridge left side of the tongue, that has those sweet taste buds in it. Okay, you rinse out your mouth, everything's nice and fresh again, and you take your Q-tip, the other end, say, you stick it into the sugar water, and now you start where you believe there is taste buds, which would be over here. Say, okay, well, I mapped out, then I felt that I had sugary taste buds over there, and now I'm going to put my Q-tip directly on that, and whoa, I don't taste anything. Okay, you continue to bring it up. No sugar water, nothing. I don't taste anything, and you keep bringing it up, and then all of a sudden, aha, there I go. I taste sweet now. So there's definitely sweet taste buds in the front. But let's go to the other side and see what's going on. And you continue now to the other side. You say, yeah, okay, I'm tasting sweet all the way around here now. So what just happened? Because the first time I tried this, there was no sense of sweet over here. And then there was a sense of sweet on the other end. But when I just tried it the second time, when I started over here, I had no sense of sweet. And that kind of sweetness experience jumped to the other side. And what does that mean? Well, it could mean that in between your first demonstration of this effect and your second demonstration of this effect, your taste buds jump to the other side of your tongue. Okay, those sweet taste buds do not jump around. They are part of the anatomy of the tongue. They do not jump around. Instead, it is again a very strong illustration, a demonstration of this idea of how flavor follows the thing that's touching your tongue once you're able to detect it, basically. So the fact that as soon as you are able to actually detect sweet from the front of your tongue, that you continue to taste sweet all around is because the Q-tip was touching your tongue there, even though there were no taste buds. So once you can detect that it's a sweet, once you can detect it's a salt or a sour or a bitter, there's also considered a new possible detector of I think it's called umami or something like that, which is kind of a seaweed thing, but don't worry about that. Some of you might have heard about that, but that's okay. But once you're able to detect what that major component of flavor is, anywhere the food is touching your tongue, you have the illusion that the food is the thing that's the source of the flavor, which of course it is, but we don't have any sweet taste buds on the side to experience that. So, oh my gosh, talking about, the importance of touch to our sense of flavor, okay? If we didn't have this illusion, it would be like, food would have flavor on one side of the tongue, but not the other side of the tongue. Food would have flavor in back, but not the front. Food wouldn't seem to be the source of flavor. But this illusion of where you're touched is where you experience, where food touches your tongue is where you experience the flavor, is so strong that, you think your taste buds could be jumping around. So it's absolutely true that where you're touched or what you touch is what you taste. What else? There's a lot of other aspects of this. So of how touch is important to your sense of taste. And that has to do with things like texture. Oh, shoot. I took this out of the slide, I thought. Okay, ignore that blind spot analogy. That was not supposed to be in there. I swear I thought I took it out of the slide. Okay, well, it popped back in there somehow. Ignore it, please. Instead, I'll go right to this, that texture strongly influences taste. And we've been talking about texture often with regard to things like custards, maybe puddings, other things like that, where you can have a more viscous texture that's shown to you visually. Remember, if you're looking at a custard and it looks thicker, but you're actually taking a sip of a thinner custard that's underneath the thick custard. Remember that little magic trick sort of thing, right? The visible thickness will influence the intensity of the flavor. But that's also true not just of the visible thickness, but also the thickness that we experience in the mouth. And so we know that from research that is done in food labs, these are producers of, like Nabisco or any of the major food companies that make desserts. Trying to think, probably yogurt companies absolutely are concerned with this. They know that the more viscous, the thicker the texture of a yogurt, of a custard, of a pudding, okay, the more flavor needs to be added to it in order to make it be experienced as a flavorful dessert. Okay, so if you have, let's go with yogurt. People have a lot of those these days. You have a thicker type of yogurt that's labeled a Greek yogurt or something like that. This Greek yogurt seems thicker to me than the non-Greek yogurt. And you put it in somebody's mouth and you say, how much flavor does this have? And on a scale from 1 to 10, they'll say it has about a 5. And then you'll take the same exact flavor and put it in a thinner yogurt, not a Greek yogurt, an American yogurt or whatever, and ask people, and they'll say, this flavor is much stronger. I'll give it a 9 or 10, even though it's the exact same flavorful components in both cases. So it is the case, the more viscous the experienced texture, it has a weaker taste, which means, again, that for something like a Greek yogurt, they have to put more flavor in it to kind of offset the brain's interpretation that thick things are going to need more flavor. Thick things are going to weaken the taste, and so some compensation needs to be done in order for you to experience a Greek yogurt as intense strawberry as a thinner yogurt. Okay, so texture, which is a tactile experience, it is a touch experience, right, will in fact have a strong influence over how intense a flavor is. Other ways that touch influences our sense of flavor, well, temperature, right? So that's something else that you're going to be able to determine through touch, right? You can certainly feel your food and determine if it's warm enough, and sometimes I'll do that, right? So if I'm cooking something in the microwave and I want to know if it's hot enough, I'll touch rice or something like that after I bring it out of the microwave, and I'll say, nah, this isn't going to be hot enough, and I'll put it back in for another minute, right? But that's also true. You could also do the same thing by putting, a spoonful or a forkful of rice in your mouth, and you could then determine whether it's warm enough. That not only is going to influence the pleasantness of the food, is it warm enough or not, it influences how strong the flavor is. And this is something that restaurants are very, very aware of, right? Not just that cold food that's supposed to be hot might seem not that pleasant, but if it's a little cooler or too hot, you're not going to experience the flavors as vividly. So much, energy is put into making sure that the temperature of the food when it reaches the table, these are good, fancy pants restaurants. So much energy is put into making sure the food reaches your table at an optimal temperature. Okay? There's a lot of timing that goes on with the kitchen and the servers and all that sort of thing. Again, not just because cold food or food that's too hot seems unpleasant to us, but it just doesn't have the right flavor. As it turns out, the best temperature for you to experience a food's flavor is about the same temperature as your tongue, which I imagine is not too far off from 98.6, maybe, I don't know, Fahrenheit, right? Because, you can take your temperature with the thermometer under your tongue, and it comes out to, somewhere around 98.6. So that's about the right temperature for food. when you're eating it. Too much warmer than that, you're not going to be able to experience the flavor. Much cooler than that, you're not going to be able to experience the flavor as vividly as you should. Okay? So there's another type of touch dimension that influences our experience of flavor, how vivid flavors are. And in fact, you wouldn't think it would make too much of a difference, but as it turns out, a difference of 2 degrees, either warmer than the optimal temperature or cooler than the optimal temperature, will change the taste. And there's lots of experiments on this. People will get the same food a little bit cooler than it should be presented or warmer than it should be presented, and are asked not just how pleasant it is, but will be asked to how much sugar is in this. Maybe it's a pie or something that tastes really good when it's a little warmed, right? And they'll say when it's cooler, maybe there's not enough sugar. Maybe when it's warmer, there's too much sugar. But when it's at the right temperature, they'll say it's just right. So it's not just an issue of pleasantness. It's not just an issue of vividness. It's an issue of being able to make determinations of specific types of flavors that's influenced by temperature, which is pretty cool. There are some other demonstrations that show the importance of temperature on food. One is called phantom flavors. And it's kind of cool. It's the same idea, but as it turns out, if you tell somebody, imagine, maybe this will be a nice little mind demonstration for you. So you're told you're given a glass of water, and you're given 2 glasses of water, okay? And you're told that one has a very diluted sugar solution in it. It's going to be very subtle. It'll taste mostly like water, but you might be able to taste a little sugar in it. And the other one, you don't know which is which. The other one has a little bit of salt in it. And then you take a sip of one, and you take a sip of the other, and try to guess which one has the little sugar in it, which one has the little salt in it. Okay. There's one other thing I need to tell you about these waters, is that one is a little bit warmer than your tongue temperature, and the other one is just a little bit cooler, maybe 3-4 degrees in each direction than your tongue temperature. Okay. And you take your sip of your warmer water, you say, I'm not sure, it's very subtle, but maybe it's sweet. And then you take a sip of the cooler water and you say, again, very subtle. I would say that this one, the cooler one, probably is the one that has salt in it. The warmer one is the one that has sugar in it. Most people will say that, even though neither water has anything. It's an illusion. Okay? Both glasses of water are the exact same water out of the exact same faucet or bottle of water or anything like that. No sugar has been added to either. No salt has been added to either. But there is this kind of little illusion where people experience warmer water as having a little bit of a sweeter taste than colder water, which has a little bit of a saltier taste. Okay. Another type of illusion that shows, again, okay, how your sense of touch, in this case, your sense of touch as it's trying to determine, or as it's experiencing temperature, okay, will have an influence over your experience of flavor. Really pretty profound, right? I mean, again, all these different things that are influencing your sense of flavor, even how your tongue is being touched, where it's being touched, whether it's being touched by something thick or thin, whether it's being touched by something warm or cold, influences your experience of flavor. For those of you that are fans of the brain, it is the case that your brain that is responsible for taste has a bunch of cells in there, a bunch of neurons in there that are actually sensitive to touch. So again, the brain seems kind of to be organized with organized with taste by incorporating the influences of other types of sensory dimensions, right? In this case, we have cells in the part of our brain responsible for taste that really are going to be sensitive to touch more than anything else. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a big picture on touch. a big picture on our sense of taste. Chapter 5, our sense of taste. That taste, out of everything else we've discussed, is the sense that seems most influenced by the other senses. So you taste what you integrate. Okay, what does this mean? It means that all the senses, okay, smell, certainly, maybe 80% of taste is smell, right? Sight, according to the dark restaurants, sound, the Pringles experiment, and touch, all these neat kind of little illusions that determine that the flavor follows the food and all that stuff. Okay, all that is based on other senses. So all taste is arguably the most multi-sensory of your senses, right? If you had no other senses besides your sense of taste, okay, or somehow there's this experiment where they can all of a sudden block all your other senses besides taste, and then you were given something on your tongue, you'd have very little experience of taste at all. Okay? There was a way to block it out. So even though we experience flavor as coming from food on our tongues, there is so much more that goes into the determination of flavor, most of it coming from our other senses. And all of them have a direct influence, right? We've already seen how sight can have a direct influence on taste, and sound and touch. But they all kind of mix around too. They can have indirect influences in that one sense, like, sight can affect another sense like touch. And that can then affect smell. Smell or taste. So they can also have what we're calling indirect influences on taste. And let me just give you a concrete example of this. Okay, so smell, how a food smells, right, can influence how viscous it then seems, right? So something with maybe a custard with a more intense smell, a stronger smell, might make you then experience that custard as more viscous than it actually is, as thicker than it actually is. And that experience then of viscousness, viscosity, in terms of how it affects our mouth, how it affects the texture of touch, all that sort of thing, in turn affects how flavorful it is. So that's what I mean by kind of indirect multisensory influences on taste, okay? In this case, we have smell affecting touch, that can then affect our sense of taste. Or touch texture can actually affect our sense of how warm something is, which we already know can have an effect on how something tastes. And actually, it's not just touch texture, it's visible texture, right? So these are subtle effects, these demonstrations, but they all really play a role in how we are experiencing flavor. So I think I say in the book that flavor is kind of based on think of it as being influenced by a kid with a chemistry set, mixing all these things together to come out with what is ultimately experienced as flavor. These things that are being mixed together are coming not just from the tongue, but mostly from the nose, and then sight, and then our experience of touch, the texture on our tongues and in our mouth, and sound even. And that's what ends up being flavor for us. So it's really kind of an interesting way of considering flavor. Flavor is something given to us by all our senses, okay, by all our senses. All right. Are there any questions on that part of the discussion of flavor, of taste? Anything? Okay, we're going to continue with our discussion of taste, talk about another aspect of it. But I think we can give you one of our practice questions now. This is not a bad place to take our little break. Okie dokie. And let's see what we got here. Yeah, something about taste that you learned about last week. And it has to do with the appearance of food. So here comes our question. Which aspects of a food's appearance influences how it tastes? Okay, is it the color, color intensity, the visible texture, or D, all of the above? I'll give you a minute to answer. Good, about another 15 seconds. Cool. All right, most of you did very well on this. The correct answer is, in fact, D, that all of these things influence how something tastes. So color, maybe the example you want to remember for color is that you can make a cherry flavored drink taste orange if you put orange food coloring in it, and vice versa. So color certainly makes a difference. Color intensity, and that's something I said. So these power drinks, Gatorade drinks, the intensity of the color, how bright a red it is, how bright an orange it is, that sort of thing, will influence how intense the flavor is experienced, right? The visible texture, we've been saying that over and over again, both last class and today, that looking at a thicker custard will have an influence over the taste as well. So, yep, the answer is D, all of the above. Go ahead and take a quick picture of that, and we will continue our discussion of taste. Great. All right. Anytime there's questions, feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Let me just make sure we got a little video to show you. So we're optimized for video. And here we go. Good. All right. This is where we left off. And what I was saying is that all of these senses influence how things taste to us, how food is flavored. All right. There's another kind of category of information we use to interpret food flavor. And to illustrate that, I'm going to introduce you to a gentleman that I think you'll find very interesting called Stephen Poe. And if you read through in the book, you know who he is. Stephen Poe, there he is. Had such a great time interviewing him, and I'll tell you why in a second. Stephen Poe is what's called a master sommelier. And maybe you've heard the term sommelier. Probably not pronouncing that very good. I never took French. Sommeliers are the folks at restaurants who, these are usually pretty fancy restaurants. What they'll do is they'll be hired to first kind of create the wine list. They'll choose the wines that they think are particularly good and might go well with that cuisine. So they're the ones that kind of create the wine list for the restaurant, decide which wines the restaurant's going to carry. But they'll also, often they would be there on many nights of the week, probably the most popular nights of the week, and they would be there to recommend wines to people. At nice restaurants, if typically the waiter asks what type of wine you want, but if you say, I want to try something new, do you have any recommendations? And the waiter might be able to recommend something, but if they aren't sure, what they'll do is they'll bring out the sommelier of the restaurant, and the sommelier will then suggest things, and typically the sommelier will say, well, what were you planning on ordering tonight for your main course? And so if people say fish or chicken, the sommelier will make a recommendation that might go particularly well with those chosen dishes, right? Some wine goes better with fish. Okay, I'm not a wine drinker really. I'm more of a beer drinker, so I don't know very much about how this works, except from what I learned from Steve. But those are sommeliers. Sommeliers, in order to be able to call themselves sommeliers and have a license, I guess it's called a license for being a sommelier, have to take courses. The people that teach those courses are called master sommeliers. And it is very hard to become a master sommelier. There aren't that many in the world, the people that actually create the courses and train the sommeliers. In fact, last I looked was probably 3 or 4 years ago. There were only 269 in the entire world that were accredited to be master sommeliers. And it's a lucrative business. I mean, these folks do very well for themselves if they've become master sommeliers, because it's very hard and they have exceptional knowledge about wine. They can really teach other sommeliers about wine. They can teach the general population about wine. It's really challenging. Now, here's my experience, right? I am not really a wine drinker. I have had many friends that are really into wine. I used to go to parties. I had a close friend before he moved away, he lived here in LA, that was like a wine connoisseur and would spend hundreds of dollars on bottles of wine. You know, he was a physician. He had that type of money. But I used to go to his parties and he'd have these wine drinking friends, and what they would do is kind of try to trick people into thinking they were drinking a type of wine that was not as good as they thought it was and everything. They'd kind of be very snooty about it. You know, I'm sure they had other aspects of their personality that were much more pleasant, but my experience was, if you're really, really into wine, you kind of look down on people that aren't into wine. In fact, they used to tease me all the time because I would prefer beer. Okay, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to talk to this master sommelier that I'm interviewing, and it's going to be a little unpleasant. They're probably going to laugh at the fact that I'm a beer drinker, all that sort of thing. Well, I could not have been more wrong about Steve Poe. And this was such a relief and such a pleasure. He was so cool, so down to earth, so not snooty. You know, he was into sports. He was an ex-Marine. He was just very, very down to earth. And I told him, you know, I don't drink wine. And actually, red wine gives me headaches a little bit. And I drink beer. And he said, that's great. You drink, you know, because there's so many great beers now that I could recommend. And I asked him, I said, so why did you get into this? He goes, he just said, I love wine, he said. It makes me so happy to learn about wines, to drink different wines, and I want to share my pleasure with everybody else. And I don't care if they know what I know. I just want to introduce people to cool new wines. And that's it. That's all. I mean, you know, he you know, he wasn't kind of, you know, pretentious and kind of looking down on folks. He just wanted to share his happiness. And I thought, this is so cool. But boy, did he have to work hard to become a master sommelier. And he told me about what goes into it. And it took him years and years and years. And I think a lot of this happened. Well, for his generation of master sommeliers, I think he had to go to France for this. I think there are ways of, now you can take the exams here in America. But yeah, he had to do a lot of traveling. He said, yeah, there are 3 exams. All of them are difficult, but there is one particularly difficult exam that you have to take that is actually going to be very relevant to how we're understanding taste here. But the other exams are kind of, you know, kind of learning through reading about wine theory and how to serve wine at a restaurant. They also have to learn to serve other things. I believe they have to learn to serve cocktails and beers and how to they have to teach people how to smell wine and stuff like that. You know, that's kind of the serving decorum sort of thing they have to take a test on. He said those weren't tough. You know, he passed those on the first time. But what he did not pass until his 3rd time taking the test was what's called the blind tasting. Okay. And this is how the blind tasting works. He is given 6 wines from anywhere in the world, 6 red wines or 6 white wines from anywhere in the world. They are put in front of him just in unlabeled glasses, and he has to determine where they are from what the type of grape is, what the style of wine is, and when, roughly, within a couple of year period, when the wine was bottled. So these are things like the grape variety, the region, and the vintage within a year or so, when the wine was bottled. And he has 25 minutes to do this. So it really is one of these kind of games that kind of similar to what my old pretentious buddies were playing at the parties, but this is more serious. This allows him to become a master sommelier, and they're given 25 minutes to do this. Not only that, not only do they have to guess all this information, they have to kind of explain their reasoning as they're going through this, right? They have to describe why they think this wine is the wine they're identifying. They have to describe the wine and how they're experiencing it as they're sipping it, right? And they're doing this as they're sitting in front of 3 master sommeliers who, have passed their exam and are there to evaluate the knowledge and the kind of sensory accuracy of the candidate who's trying to pass the exam. Okay. I think I have a little video clip here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, judged by 3 masters. Let me go ahead and actually jump here. Here we go. So here is somebody practicing for their master sommelier exam. And it looks like, yeah, there's his red wines there. And you'll see what he's trying to do. He's trying to not only identify what the wine is, you're going to see him working on a specific wine, but he has to be very, very detailed with how he's reaching that conclusion.
Cheese rind, honey. Lots of honey. Wine is off dry. Medium intensity. Medium body. Frame wine, acidity is high. Tannin low. Alcohol, medium. Fruits have changed a little bit on the palate. I'm getting some apricot, peach notes, a little stone fruit, along with the lemon lime. And that Meyer lemon is converted into key lime. Quality is medium. Final conclusion, Chenin, France, Loire. Put this at Vouvray.
Wine is dry.
Demi, Sec, and Vintage. Again, 2009. Wine number 3 is white wine.
So he's absolutely correct on that one. I'm just amazed that they're able to do this. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of what Stephen Poe had to go through, and he has to do that for all 6 wines. And so, as you can see, it's not just guessing the type of wine. Oh, this is a Chardonnay. This is, a rosé or whatever. He has to get some things very specific down to the year. And by the way they know the year is by kind of guessing other aspects of the wine, where it's from and all that sort of thing. And then they have an idea of what the weather was like in different years or spans of years. And so if there was a particularly hot summer, say, in that wine region, then the wine should end up tasting a certain way. So that's how they do the year of the wine. But my gosh, it's amazing when I watch that, right? So he's talking about all the different aspects. So first he did the smelling, and he could determine that there was a honey smell to it, and I can't remember what else he mentioned there. And then he put it on his tongue and described the palate and said that it had a fruity aspect to it that was apricot, and there was a lemon aspect. But then he said it's not lemon, it's more like Meyer lemon. So I don't know if you know the difference between lemon and Meyer lemon. We have a little Meyer lemon tree here at our house. Meyer lemons tend to be a little sweeter than regular lemons. And I mean, I'd be hard pressed if somebody gave me a lemon and a Meyer lemon. I'm not sure I'd be able to tell the difference, even though we have some. But he's able to taste all these different dimensions in the wine, and he's using those to kind of determine what type of wine it is, what region is it from, and then what year it was actually produced. Now, the way they do this, I think you're going to find very interesting. He has to spend years, I think years, learning production techniques of wines. Okay, knowing that there are certain ways that wine go through multiple fermentations. Wines are grown in a certain type of soil, right? And what the flavor ramifications of all those dimensions might be, right? So, if it has more of a fruity flavor, and if you say he's already determined it's a chinois, whatever that was, if it's got more of a apricot flavor, then it might have been grown in this soil. If it has more of a Meyer lemon flavor, then it might have been grown in another type of soil, right? And there are books on that are written for people who grow grapes and make wine, so they know how to get these flavors. If you want this type of flavor, if you want kind of an emphasis in the flavor of Meyer lemon, then use this soil. Grow your grapes in this type of soil. If you want more of a sour flavor on top of that, then maybe you want to have it go through 2 fermentation stages. You don't need to know the details. What you need to understand, though, what you need to appreciate is, this is almost a science, right? This is a science, and he's saying, okay, you want this in the flavor, then here's how you have to do it, right? And folks like Steve Poe would have to have learned what the flavor ramifications are for all these different production techniques. So he would sit there in his room, if he's studying for his exam, he would sit there in a hotel room with a big stack of books, volumes of books on wine production in all phases of wine production, and bottles of wine. And I would imagine what you saw him do, and I imagine this is absolutely what they have to do, is they probably can't ingest too much wine, or they're not going to care too much about where it's made after a while. So they spit most of their wine out, but he would read something and then find a wine that was a good kind of example of what he's reading about, chinois in a mineral soil or something like that, and read the ramifications, what the flavor should be like, and then grab a bottle of wine that was from there and try to taste what should be apparent in that wine based on what he's reading. So it was reading and tasting and reading and tasting, mostly spitting out the wines afterwards so he could, not fall asleep or whatever. But that took years. And I got a little quote from him that's actually right from the book, but I think this will kind of really emphasize how detailed their knowledge becomes. So he says, I remember that I was working to identify the last of my 6 wines, okay, the very last of his 6 glasses of wine. Time was running out. It's 25 minutes. I had looked at the wine's legs. The wine's legs, by the way, are when you kind of hold the wine glass up and you kind of swish it around. You can see with wine, the fluid will kind of slowly come off the edge, and they kind of look like little legs on the glass. But you can tell a lot from about the sugar content in the wine and that sort of thing by how quickly they kind of roll off the inside of the glass. So those are the wine's legs. Okay, inhaled its bouquet, took a sniff of the wine, and then taken a sip. I was trying to describe it as if it were an overripe Cabernet Syrah blend, probably from Australia. Maybe you know more about that than I do. But something just didn't seem right. I thought about it again. I thought again about its characteristics. It was a little bit off dry. I think I would understand what that meant. That it was dry, but not too dry. I mean, kind of more tart and not so sweet. It was big, meaning it had a lot of flavor to it, I think. It had high alcohol, and I can imagine I might be able to detect that in a wine. I don't know. It had a spiciness, maybe I could detect that. I don't know, maybe you folks would understand what that means. And it tasted a little like dried raisins. Okay. I'm not sure exactly what the taste difference between moist raisins and dried raisins might be, but he can obviously. And then it just clicked. I thought, oh my gosh, this is an Amarone, which is a red wine from Veneto, Italy. It was one of those situations where the studying and the focus just took over. So this is what I think is so darn cool about this. We've been talking a lot about perceptual expertise throughout our class, right? We talked about the expertise Daniel Kish has. Because of his blindness, he's learned to use sound in ways that most of us can't. We talked about the expertise that the sound engineers have, right? The blind baseball players and their ability to be very, very accurate when it comes to perceiving approaching sound sources, that sort of thing, right? But here's a different type of expertise. Here's an expertise that comes from learning from books, right? This is a perceptual expertise that comes from reading and understanding. And it affects how he is then able to perceive these different dimensions of the wine. I think it's a really interesting example of perceptual expertise. It's not a perceptual expertise that comes from, having to compensate for a lost sense, or it comes from, having a job where you need to listen to things a little bit more carefully or something like that. It's an expertise that comes from your understanding, your knowledge, your book knowledge, in this case, of something. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. So we can say that not only do we taste what the other senses give us, we taste what we integrate, but we taste what we understand. Okay, we perceive what we understand. In this case, it is understanding the kind of the science of wine production. Okay, all the different sorts of production techniques, of grape growing techniques, of bottling techniques that have bearing on what your flavor experience should be. Cool. Now, I'm not the only person that thinks that this type of perceptual expertise is really cool. There's been a lot of research on wine expertise, as it turns out. And when I was writing the book, I was able to find a bunch of new research on brain scanning of these individuals. Wine experts being brought into the laboratory and asked to make judgments of wine to see how accurate they are. And it's really informative, this research. It really tells us something interesting about what, kind of book learning can do for our perceptual experience. Okay, we'll talk about the brain stuff in just a second, but let's talk about bringing these folks in, bringing someone like Stephen Poe into the lab and seeing how sensitive they are to aspects of wine. Here's the first thing you can do, okay? Is you give, you blindfold the person, say, and you give them two wine glasses and say, okay, one is water and the other one has just a little drop, from like a, eyedropper of wine in it. Which do you think has the wine in it? Okay, so they're basically two glasses of water, but one that has just a single drop of wine in it. He sips one and sips the other, and he's like, geez, it's really hard. They both taste like water to me, but I'll say this one, maybe, okay? And then you bring non-specialists in, and you ask them to do it. And as it turns out, maybe a little surprising right now, but the non-specialist, like most of us, me certainly, okay, just does as well as the expert, as the master sommelier. So when it comes to, our tongues detecting that a wine is present, that there is wine, a little wine in the glass, we're not different from the masters. They are not special in that way. There's another thing you can do with them, and that is this. You give them two glasses of the same wine, and you put a couple of drops of another wine into one of the glasses. So we have two red wines here in front of me. Okay, they've both been filled with the same wine out of the same bottle, but one of the glasses has a couple of drops of a different type of wine, a different style of wine, say I don't know, we're drinking rosé and there's a little Chardonnay in it, or I'm having trouble. Zinfandel, that's a very kind of distinct wine. One of the glasses has these are both Chardonnays, but one of the glasses has a couple of drops of a Zinfandel in it, which is a different type of wine. Okay, and you ask now first the master sommelier to take 2 sips and say which of these 2 has the Zinfandel in it. Okay, and then you ask the non-expert, like me, come in and say which one it is. And I wouldn't be good at it, but neither would the master sommelier. So what I'm trying to establish here is these are things that the master sommelier does not excel at. First of all, detecting that a wine is in a glass of water, or secondly, discriminating that 2 wines are different just based on a little drops. So let's get that out of the way. They are not better at having thresholds for wine, detecting that there's a wine present in a glass of water, or in discriminating wine when there's just a little bit of a difference between the wines. So that's not what gives them their perceptual expertise, this kind of ability to detect a wine or detect differences in wine, okay? And by the way, this is also true of smells. You can do the exact same experiment, not have it based on taste, but also smells. This is also true for the expert. And in fact, there's evidence that they fall for this little illusion that you can use on your friends if you ever want to, kind of get out of a sticky situation. Maybe you have friends that are wine snobs or really, really like red wine, and they kind of surprise you at the last minute and say they're coming over. And so you go to your cupboard and you look for your red wine and you say, oh my gosh, we only have white wine in the house. And they're wine snobs. They don't like white wine. They only like red wine. What you can do, it works to a little degree at least, is you can take some red food coloring, drop it into the white wine, and then serve it to your guests, and they will believe they're drinking a red wine, okay? And that's not just true of your friends, it would be true of Steve Poe when it comes to smelling wine, at least. I don't know if that would work when it comes to sipping wine. This is called the wine color illusion. It's not critical, but it does speak to the fact that it looks like here's another instance of color influencing at least our sense of smell, which we know could have an influence over our sense of taste. And it would even work. I asked Steve Poe, I said, could you imagine this working on you? And he goes, well, he said, I think if I sip it for a while, I'm going to think that there's something wrong with it. But if I were to smell it only and look at it and see the color, and if it was colored well, yeah, I could imagine I might fall for it a little bit. Because for him, wine drinking is certainly a multi-sensory experience, right? He's looking at the legs of the wine, he's looking at the color. Often they hold it up to the light so they can get a better sense of what the color is like, right? And then the smell is important, right? The mouth feels important. So he said, yeah, for me, Stephen Poe would say, wine drinking is certainly multi-sensory, and I could imagine you could get something like an illusion even for experts like me, right? Anyway. So there you have it, though, that they don't have a better kind of sensitivity to the presence of wine or for differences in wine. What they do show is a very different brain response to wine. And this is where things got really interesting. As I was writing the chapter, I was reading about the most recent research. So they have master sommeliers in a fMRI scanner, right? And they ask them to sip some wine, and they do the same with non-experts like Rosenblum, who doesn't drink a lot of wine, and look at my responses. And what you find is that for these masters, for people who are expert wine drinkers, including these master sommeliers, is they will show responses in parts of their brains that the novices like me will not show. They will show that there is more response where our smell and taste converge. Okay, so there are parts of the brain where smell and taste kind of get combined, they get integrated, and boy, for the master sommeliers, those parts light up like crazy. When I'm sipping wine, that doesn't happen as much, right? But there's an enhanced smell, taste convergence in that part of the brain. Not only that, but for someone like Steve Poe, okay. By the way, I'm just going to talk about handedness very quickly. He's a right-handed guy. Most people are right-handed. So what I'm going to be talking about now is brain areas, mostly for right-handed people. when he takes a sip, he shows more activity in his left hemisphere, the left side of his brain. You've heard about the brain being, yeah, here, I don't want to get too technical, but you're looking at a top view, you're looking at a bird's eye view down on top of a brain, and there is a left hemisphere. There's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, okay? You know, kind of, you've seen the, you know, how brains look, they have kind of a crease down the middle, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. When Steve Poe sips wine, he shows much more excitement, much more activity in his left hemisphere than I would, okay? Which is interesting. Let's talk a little bit about hemispheres, just generally. Things are much more complicated than I'm going to portray them right now. But to some degree, at least, for right-handed individuals, the left hemisphere is considered to be the part of the brain that's more analytical. The left hemisphere is related to language and mathematical skill, that sort of thing. The right hemisphere is thought to be better for kind of spatial relations between things, you know, recognizing the spatial relation between parts of a face or something like that, this part of my brain. Things are more complicated than that. I don't want you to, you know, because I know people have a tendency, if they don't know the science, to think that, well, maybe I'm more of a left brain than a right brain person. It doesn't work so cleanly at all. But it is the case that for, you know, analytical sort of processes, the left hemisphere seems to do that more than the right hemisphere. Oh my gosh, Gardner's here again, so I apologize for the background noise. But that happens for Steve Poe when he drinks wine, okay? And the left hemisphere is considered to be, as I said, more involved in analytical processes, which makes sense. So when Steve Poe drinks a wine, when he sips a wine, his brain is going through more analytical processes of the experience than mine is, which makes sense, okay? So we're already seeing very different brains. So they have smell-taste convergence that is heightened. They have more analytical processes, which is appearing in the left hemisphere of the person's brain. Also, they show more activation in brain areas associated with memory and language. Language areas are probably going to be mostly left hemisphere still, but that's the idea, right? So what are they doing? Well, let's think about, you know, how the process might work. They're sipping the wine and they're now kind of trying to categorize it from a particular part of the world, particular type of soil, all that sort of stuff. So they're bringing up a lot of memory information that I'm just sipping it and saying, yippee, right? And then he's got a very, very rich description for things. You heard that candidate in the video you just saw, where you know, he's describing the palate and describing the smell and all these things. He has so many descriptive terms, and that's being accessed when Steve Poe sips a wine, as it shows up in an fMRI sort of display, which is cool. So that's where they're different. That's where the experts are different. It's not like they have more sensitivity to detecting the presence of wine, or even detecting differences, subtle differences. You know, our tongues are, as novices, are very much like the tongues of Steve Poe, right? Where we differ is what's going on in the kind of the deep parts of the brain. Experts seem to have a sophisticated conceptual understanding of their perceptual experience and how it can be then used to identify wines and identify production techniques and all that, as well as a very, very rich descriptive language, meaning that they have all these terms they can use, which are actually helping them, you know, kind of zero in on the sensory experiences they're having. So it's not like they have more sensitive tongues. It's just that they can use their understanding to then categorize what they're experiencing on their tongues, to help their ability, right? Kind of cool. So this is, in fact, you know, when I told Steve Poe, you know, what the research was showing us is this is exactly the sort of thing that he believes the whole process and the studying for the master exam involves. That what opening the books, reading about all the details of production technique, and then experiencing how that appears in the flavor of the wine, that's really how you learn to become a master sommelier. That your explicit knowledge, and all explicit knowledge means here is like your book learning, learning the details, explicit details of how wine is produced, then helps you pay attention to different aspects of the flavor. What he calls constellation of flavors, which is just, a way of kind of thinking about how the flavors should go together. So let's give an example. This is a wonderful example that he gave. Something called malolactic fermentation. I had to look this up. So malolactic fermentation is a wine production technique that involves taking the wine after it's been fermented, after the alcohol becomes present in it, and having it do that once more again, okay, after that first fermentation. And they use some type of yeast or something like that to allow it to go through that second fermentation. And it's only done with certain wines around the world. I guess maybe it's done in France. In certain regions of France, they'll use a malolactic fermentation in the production technique. Okay, he learned about that in a book. He also learned from that chapter in the book that there are important flavor ramifications for doing a malolactic fermentation in the wine itself. So malolactic fermentation creates a constellation, a group of flavors in the wine that are, here, I'll give them to you: buttery texture, sauerkraut, and yogurt. So he goes, whenever I taste those sort of flavors in a wine, okay, buttery texture, I think I could understand buttery texture. So you put it on your tongue and it really kind of feels like butter. I think I can imagine what that is. A sauerkraut flavor in a wine? I mean, again, maybe you folks, if you drink wine, know this better than me. I'm not sure I would be able to taste sauerkraut in wine, and maybe I could. I don't know. And yogurt? Oh, that's subtle. I'm not sure I could sip a wine and say, oh, a pronounced yogurt flavor. I don't think I could do that at all. But these folks can, and so when they are able to experience, say, any one of those sort of things, they can take another sip to see if maybe the other flavors are in there, right? So imagine this. So you're doing your master sommelier exam, you're on your last wine, and you take a sip, and all of a sudden you realize it's a little buttery. Cool. All right. Well, buttery texture, that could be an outcome of this malolactic fermentation. Let me see if there's other evidence for malolactic fermentation in there. And because you've done your studying, that the other types of flavor outcomes of malolactic fermentation are sauerkraut and yogurt. Let's take another sip. Oh yeah, there's a little sauerkraut in there. And we've got the buttery texture. I bet this wine has gone through malolactic fermentation, but let me take one more sip because I know another outcome of malolactic fermentation is yogurt. Yep, it's got yogurt, sauerkraut, buttery texture. The wine has gone through malolactic fermentation, which means it's from a particular region in France. So there you go. There's how studying, understanding kind of this explicit detail. What I mean by explicit here is kind of very conscious, knowledge of something about wine is going to go ahead and allow you now to attend to different flavors and groups of flavors, what he's calling constellation of flavors. That's going to give you information about, say, where the wine was bottled, the style of wine, the grape type, and potentially the year and how the warmth of that particular season or the coolness of that season would have a bearing on the flavors as well. Okay, I think I have the quote right here. Do I? No, shoot. Let's skip these. We'll come back to it. And I'll come back to those things. I just wanted to give you the quote right now. Okay, a lot of background noise, I apologize. There's no question that the more knowledge you have, the more your tasting is informed. Okay. If you know, for example, that they use tufa subsoil in the Anjou-Saumur region of France, then when you're trying a Cabernet and get that chalky, stony minerality on the wine, you become confident that you're tasting a Cabernet Franc from the Loire Valley, probably Chinois. Okay, I'm not sure what all these terms mean, but it's another example. Stephen Poe's giving us a really nice example of being able to taste a constellation of flavors. Chalk, stone mineral, I don't know, stony minerality. I'm not sure what that is and how I would experience that necessarily. But now, since you've had that constellation of flavors, you can then go ahead and say, oh, it's probably been produced here. And now that you know it's been produced here, now you can take another sip and see, what type of grape, which is, common in that area it might be, or what type of year, depending on the wetness, the coolness, the heat of that particular year, the flavor outcome might be. So it's kind of like sipping, understanding, allowing new focus. Sipping, understanding, allowing new focus again and again, okay? And that's how they do it. That's how they do it. And again, I think it's so cool that they're getting this, again, explicit kind of book knowledge to change how they attend to their sensory experience. Okay. We're going to talk about more of that in perception, but I just think it's such a great example. Okay, let's go back to these terms that I put up here as well. You got your example now of how this works, and this is considered to be the basis of the superior recognition performance. In fact, you do find that there are perceptual tests that these folks are very, very good at. Yeah. Hold on just a second. Yeah, okay, I guess I took this out. So here's a perceptual test. Remember I talked about some perceptual tests that they're no better at than the novices like you and me. They can't detect that there's a wine drop present any better than you and me. They can't detect that there's a difference in the wine any better than you and me. But boy, when it comes to similarity ratings, they're very, very, very good. So for example, say I was given 10 wines and I was told to rate the similarity between them as I sip them. And I say, okay, these two wines are similar, and this one's kind of similar. So I have a group of 3, and then I have a group of 2 over here, and I have a group of 4 over here. Does that come out to or 5 over here? I have 10 wines now, grouped based on their similarity. I would come in then like a week later, and ask for the same things. I would probably not be very consistent. Right? I would not be very consistent, but my gosh, Steve Poe would be exactly consistent time and time again, because he's able to categorize wines, okay, and experience their similarities across very, very concrete dimensions. Okay, yeah, these 3 wines are always going to go together. They're from the Chinois Valley. These 2 wines are always going to go together because they're from Australia. These 4 wines or the 5 wines are going to go together because they're from, California. And I know this because they have different flavor ramifications, and he'll be consistent time and time and time again. And that's from his explicit knowledge, his explicit understanding of how wines are created. Okay. Cool. I think I have one more slide here on that goes with our discussion of flavor, but I think this might be a good time to take a little break because it does change the nature of the discussion a little bit. So let's take our break now and come back in 10 minutes. Okay, we are back. Hopefully everything's working all right. How are we doing? Oh my gosh, that's not good. Um, I'm about to run out of batteries, but oh boy. All right, hopefully I'll be okay. Um, I'll tell you what we'll do. Um, hmm. Yeah, okay, we're all right. Hopefully I'll have enough batteries to get through. If there's any questions, go ahead. I'd be happy to answer any questions, either about the exam, about any of the material, about anything else. Nothing? Okay, no problem. We will continue then our discussion of wine. And let's go here. Oops, hold on just a second. Yeah. Wait, where am I? Hold on just a sec. All right, just give me a second here. A little strange. Where is everybody? Okay, there we are. All right, let me make sure I'm pinned. And cool, let's go back here. Heck. There I am. All right. Sorry about this. I think we are ready to share. Yes. There I am. There's my little picture. Okay. So we've already been through this. Let me just put the slide back up again. Just to remind ourselves of the big picture here, we're finishing our discussion of taste, and we've gotten into another aspect of taste, which has to do with what we understand. There's discussions of what we expect also being important in taste, and you should definitely take a look at that in the book. So if, things like if you're told a wine is from a particular region, like France, you're going to expect it and probably experience the flavor as different than if you're told it's from North Dakota. You should look at that. There's going to be certainly questions on the exam on that topic. But we also are going through this as a way to see how explicit knowledge, how actually reading through material on how wine is produced can actually have an influence on how we experience the wine, how we actually can pick out the different flavors, how we can attend to different aspects of the taste. Okay, so that's where we left off by going through Stephen Poe. Now, it's interesting. Hold on just a second here. This idea, oh boy. Sorry, I'm just going to lose my battery on my slide display here. Not for you guys. You guys will be fine, but I thought this was plugged in and it's not working for some reason. Anyway, this idea of explicit knowledge enhancing perceptual experience is something that I think a lot of scientists have been interested in, and it's not just related to wine drinking. It's probably the most studied version of this, but it's also been studied in other contexts. So that's what we're going to continue talking about. So this is going to be a little bit of a tangent from taste, but is going to kind of expand on the idea of having a perceptual experience that is changed based on our kind of general understanding of how something works. Okay, so it's a kind of an exploration in perceptual expertise where the expertise has to do with what we know, basically. So you taste, this is still kind of continuing on this, but it's now going to expand into other areas of perception. So explicit knowledge can enhance perception in other areas. Besides wine tasting, I think the other one that's most studied is probably chess. And I don't know if you play chess or you've ever seen videos of expert chess players, or even maybe there's a few films that, The Queen's Gambit, maybe you've seen that. But you know what goes into the work of being an expert chess player. And certainly see videos online of this type of skill, where there's a chess champion, chess master, who is playing multiple players at one time. Often you see these videos of people in a park, or maybe in a room, some large room somewhere, where there's kind of a series of tables, or a couple of large tables around them, with say anywhere from 5 to 10 players, that the expert is playing at the same time. It's just amazing. So the experts, participating in 10 different chess matches all at the same time. And typically the people that are there to play the chess master are pretty good, not masters, but they're, very competent players. And what you'll see with these folks is, as they're kind of going to one side of the room to look at the board of a particular person, they'll move their piece, and then rather than going all the way back to the other side to move their piece, they'll, in order to kind of make the whole situation more efficient, they'll just say, "Oh, Bill, my next move for your game would be to move the pawn to knights 3. Move my pawn to knights 3," or something like that. And so they would then move the piece for the champion, so the champion didn't have to, go back and forth all around. The champion basically is able to play these multiple games just by thinking about what's going on. And yes, it's absolutely the case that these champs can memorize the boards with, just looking at them for a little while. And so after the champ moves the piece over here, he doesn't need to go back, or she doesn't need to go back and look at that board, because they have that board. They have Bill's board memorized, right? Now, they absolutely can do this. They can memorize the position of pieces on a chessboard based on the rules of the game. However, if the pieces are just randomly spread across the board so that it's virtually impossible for those pieces to have gotten there based on the rules of chess. In fact, for the pieces to be in the arrangement they are in, they have to deviate from the rules of chess. Then the chess player, the expert chess player, is no better than the novice at memorizing the board. So that ability, that real kind of special skill of being able to memorize the configuration of pieces, needs to be based on the rules of chess. They need to be based on how the pieces might have gotten there, because what the expert, the perceptual expert here, being the chess pro, is doing is using the explicit knowledge they have of the rules of chess in order to remember these pieces. So it is a perceptual skill to be able to remember a chessboard details by looking at it, but it is a skill that is dependent on their explicit knowledge of chess and the rules of chess. If the pieces are, again, randomly scattered on the board, they're no better at remembering the location of those pieces than you and I would be as non-chess pros. Okay, this isn't just true of expert chess players. It's also true of coaches and musicians and circuit designers, composers or conductors. I think a lot of this research is done with conductors in music. They'll be able to remember like the entire score of the orchestra parts, the violin part, the oboe part, the trumpet part, and all that sort of thing, by looking at it quickly. Okay, they'll remember. So it is the case that the conductor will just look at a page, and then the orchestra will start playing what's on the page, and then rather than, if they hear a mistake, rather than looking down at the at the score, they'll say, oh, trumpet, you came in a little early there. That's a quarter note, not an eighth note or something like that. And they'll be able to memorize it completely. However, that memorization will be dependent on the rules of music applying. What typically happens in music. There are certain rules that allow certain harmonies and melodies and that sort of thing to go together. And if it's 12-tone music, maybe, right? When we talked about that weird type of music with that seems like it's kind of random notes. It's not completely random, but that's going to be very hard. If it's Western music, the conductor's used to Western music, they know the rules of Western music, and they've studied those rules for years and years and years. They can memorize that giant page of music, okay, for the entire orchestra, but it has to follow those rules that the composer studied. It's also been shown with circuit designers, expert circuit designers circuits being like circuit boards, electronic boards that might go in a computer or something like that. They can look at it, they'll memorize it, and they'll be able to determine details of it if they're asked to recall later and all that sort of thing. But again, it has to follow the rules that the circuit designer has become an expert with. Okay, so memorization, that perceptual expertise is a perceptual expertise, but it is dependent. I guess we could say it's kind of specific on the domain and the rules that exist in the domain of that perceptual skill, right? So let's go back to wine experts. This is kind of nice. This will make sense. So in an experiment where they took the wine experts like Steve Poe into the laboratory and asked them to remember word pairs, okay? Word pairs that have to do with wine come up, and they were like something like full-bodied and prune, okay? That would come up, and they'd have to memorize that. And then later on, they'd have to recall that, right? Or they see there's lots of ways you could test this. You then see for the test phase of the experiment, the word full-bodied comes up, and they have to type in what that second word was based on what was presented to them earlier in the experiment. Test this lots of ways. They're outstanding at this, right? They're really, really good at that type of thing. If, in fact, the descriptive words should go together, okay? So, and I believe this is true as I looked it up when I was writing about it, full-bodied and prune are both descriptors that you apply to red wine, okay? Lime is a descriptor you'd apply to white wine. If, in fact, the expert in this, kind of word word pair remembering experiment were presented with full-bodied and lime, which are not really a meaningful pair. One has to do with a red wine, lime has to do with a white wine. They will not remember any better than you and me. Okay? The word pairs they have that they're able to remember well are together because they describe a specific type of wine, and they have that knowledge. Okay, again, they have an expertise, but it is kind of bounded by the rules in this case of wine and wine production and the flavor outcome of wine production and all that sort of thing. Okay, same type of thing with circuit designers, musicians, conductors looking at scores, coaches. Looking at football plays that are designed, for football teams, that sort of thing. They're looking at those little, X's or I guess they're zeros and squares or something like that, right? They'll have a really nice ability to remember those things in a lot of detail, but only if those things follow the rules of football, American football in this case, right? Cool. That makes sense. And so it's a perceptual expertise, but it's a perceptual expertise that's based on the rules of that domain. Okay. Now, there is also something that these perceptual experts seem to be able to do that the rest of us aren't when it comes to this conceptual knowledge. Okay. It has to do with something called the verbal overshadowing effect. And you may have learned this in other psychology classes if you taken them. Maybe you learned it in high school. I don't know. You'll probably get the idea. And in order to get the idea, I like to tell a little story, and it's just a little a troubling story that happened to me, just to kind of, warn you a little bit, but it all worked out in the end, don't worry. But I was held up many, many years ago, okay, at gunpoint. And, happened somewhere else, don't worry, I don't want to, shock anybody or anything like that. It all worked out in the end. Nobody was hurt, but it was, a very memorable experience, right? So what happened? Okay. I'm getting out of a car with a friend. These guys run up to us and just scream, "Give us your wallet and your purse," or something like that. We turn around. Actually, this kind of thing is interesting. When that happens to you, you kind of think, oh, maybe it's one of my friends that's, we didn't know we're going to be here and surprising us, right? But we turn around and these guys had guns. And so quickly we gave them our wallet. Friend gave her purse to them and they ran. Okay. Well, we were getting out of a car to go to a restaurant. So we then, we go into the restaurant, even though we don't have any money, and sit down and tell them what happened. And the restaurant folks were just wonderful. They were very, very supportive. They gave us some wine to relax. They comped our dinner. It was very nice of them. But they also called the police for us because, we needed to report what happened. And the police came in and they asked about the event. And then they asked us to describe the folks in some detail, describe what they look like, what they were wearing, how old, that sort of thing. And we did our best. It was a very fast event. And, when there's a gun and, kind of pointing at you, it's kind of hard to look at anything else, but we did our best. And we felt that we described them pretty well. Okay. It took a little while to go through the entire description. They asked a lot of questions about the appearance. Cool. And we're just about to finish up. The police are kind of wrapping things up, and all of a sudden they get a call on their radio that says, "Wow, we just found two guys down the street who look an awful lot like the people that were just described in that incident." So I guess the police were kind of conveying some of this information to their colleagues as we were going through this. And they said, well, we've apprehended them, that we have them down here at the end of the street. And if you'd like, you can bring the folks who were held up down here, and we can have them say whether or not they are the people that held them up. And we said, okay, a little kind of nervous about it. And they said, don't worry. The police said, don't worry. You're going to be sitting in the back of the car. We're going to be shining lights on them. It's at night at this point, and they're not going to be able to see in the car. So don't worry about that. It's still a little scary. Anyway, they brought us down there. They did exactly what they said they were going to do. These two guys are standing off, in front of us at the end of the street. They're shining lights on them. The guys are sitting there smiling ear to ear. So they certainly were not smiling when they held us up. I don't know if that's something that people know what to do or something like that, but they were looking as innocent and as, kind of as cordial as possible. And they asked us, please turn to us and say, okay, can you say without any doubt that these are the folks that held you up? And both my friend and I said, no. I mean, they kind of do fit the description we just gave you, but we cannot be absolutely sure. We cannot be absolutely sure. I said, okay, well, then we need to let them go. They don't have any wallets or purses on their bodies. So, we don't have any other evidence that they're the people unless you could absolutely identify them. And we could, so they let them go. That was the end of it. Now, here's what's interesting and relevant to what we're discussing now. What happened when they asked us to describe the perpetrators, the folks that held us up, is it actually inhibited our ability to then recognize them when we saw them. And this is a well-known effect that occurs with suspects and witnesses, right? Witnesses, if they are asked to verbally describe the appearance of a perpetrator, are then less able to recognize the perpetrator because of that description. And that's what this verbal overshadowing effect is about, right? The description that the witness gives inhibits their actual recognition of the person. Very well known effect. It's problematic when it comes to things like police lineups. It makes it harder for witnesses to identify perpetrators, right? But they need to do it. I mean, the police need to do it because, you know, they're not certain that, well, first of all, they need to go find the folks that potentially did it. So they need to go out and look for folks that fit the description and you know, look suspicious or doing suspicious things or something like that, right? So they have to have a description, right? But at the same time, they know the description is then going to make it less easy for the witnesses to identify them when they see them. So the descriptions, the verbal descriptions, inhibit recognition. Now, so the classic example, let me just get this in. This is eyewitnesses describing faces, yeah. It not only happens, though, in that context. This is maybe the most, you know, kind of important context it happens because it has ramifications for people's lives potentially. It also happens to most of us with things like smells and tastes, which is kind of interesting, right? So let's go with wines. If you were sipping a wine and asked to give it a description based on your kind of novice descriptors, I don't know, here comes Rosenblum doing it. He's going to be really bad at it. Okay, so I take a sip of red wine and say, it's a little tart. It's a little, I don't know, it kind of rolls around my tongue kind of in a funny way. Oh, now I'm tasting a tiny bit of sweetness, but it still tastes tart. And I'm not very good at this, but I try my best. I maybe give 4 or 5, 6 different terms that describe it. Okay. If I am then asked to recognize, say, a couple days later, which of 3 glasses of wine is the one that I sipped 3 days earlier, I'm going to be worse at it now than if I had never given a description, right? So another subject who came in the same day took a sip of it, and they're told, you're going to be asked about this later. Don't give us any terms, don't give us any description, but you're going to be asked about, you know, remembering this later. We're going to see if you can recognize it. Okay. And I was told that too, by the way, in my descriptor. They're going to do better at recognizing the wine, okay, because they have not given a verbal description to a wine like I did. I'm going to be worse at it. Okay. My recognition of the wine when I sip it 2 days later is going to be inhibited. Okay. It's going to be made worse because I was asked to give a verbal description of it. That's true of taste. That's true of smells, which people are not very good at describing, right? So, you know, I'm not very good at that. I think I'm pretty sensitive to smells, but as I said, but if I smell a perfume or a cologne and I'm asked to describe it, it's a little sweet maybe. I guess I smell something like flowers and some sort of spice or something like that. Okay. If I even gave that type of description when it came time 2 days later to try to recognize that smell again, given a series of smells, I would be worse for having given that description. That's verbal overshadowing. My verbal description of something makes it harder to recognize later. And that's true of most of us with smells and tastes. Okay. It is true for people who are a casual wine drinker. So maybe you're a casual wine drinker, or you have siblings or parents that drink wine, say, you know, once every week or a few weeks or something like that. You know, you're not really you have wines that you like, but it's not like you know very much about it. They'll have the same problem, right, that I just had with my little example in trying to recognize wines by describing it. Okay. If you're asked to describe something like a wine, a smell, like the face of a perpetrator, that description overshadows your ability to then recognize them. You'd be better off by, in some ways, not describing it. True of casual wine drinkers, true of most of us with smells and tastes. But maybe unsurprisingly, not true of someone like Stephen Poe. In fact, it's probably the case that when he gives a verbal description to a wine, he is actually then better at recognizing it later. I'm sure he's much better at recognizing wine overall, but it probably helps him. He doesn't have that problem where his description is going to make his recognition performance worse. So wine experts are not They do not show the verbal overshadowing effect with wine. Musicians, like conductors, do not show the verbal overshadowing effect with musical scores, because their descriptive terminology is so rich and so accurate, so specific, that if anything, it actually helps their recognition memory later on, which is interesting. It's another kind of way that these perceptual experts are different from the rest of us. Okay. Any questions on this slide that I just went through? It's, it is related to taste still. It's certainly related to wine drinking, but I wanted to go beyond that and give you some concepts that are more general to perceptual expertise, having to do with, the importance of kind of, being able to memorize things that are based on the actual rules of whatever domain that you're an expert in, and the fact that these folks are not, I guess, they're not affected by the verbal shadowing effect that the rest of us are. Okay, cool. That ends our discussion of taste. We will then move into touch, which will not be on this exam, but on the second exam. But this would be a nice place, I think, to do our second polling question. And our second polling question is something I taught you earlier today about taste and how flavor follows taste, or how follows food. So the question is this: why does a hard candy taste sweet wherever it is located in your mouth? Where does a hard candy taste sweet? Why does a hard candy taste sweet wherever it is located in your mouth? A, you have sweet taste buds all over your mouth. B, your taste buds move around to follow the candy. That true? C, tactile capture, okay, makes it seem like the sweet flavor is located wherever the candy touches your mouth. Or D, none of the above. I'll give you a minute to answer this one. How are we doing there? Good, we're doing well. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Okay. Actually, while you're doing that, I'm gonna quit this and bring up this. Cool. All right. Looks good. Let's end this. Most of you got this right. The correct answer on this one is, in fact, D. Yeah. Tactile capture is something we introduced earlier today, and you now know that, yes, in fact, it is the case that flavor follows food around, because there's kind of this illusion that there is a sweetness where it's touching your tongue, even though there's no sweet detectors there. Right. I think that the most compelling demonstration is this idea of the Q-tip going around. And once that you'd establish that there's a sweetness on the Q-tip, wherever that Q-tip touches, the sweetness follows it. And so you think that you actually have sweet taste buds on the side of your tongue, and you don't. Right. So A is incorrect. You don't have sweet taste buds all over your mouth. You just have them in a very specific spot in the front. Your taste buds move around. They don't do that. Okay, that's part of anatomy. It's like your fingers moving around or your eyes kind of jumping around. Your taste buds do not move around. Or D, tactile capture. C, tactile capture makes it seem like the sweet flavor is located wherever the candy touches your mouth. That is absolutely the correct answer. And none of the above is incorrect, because C is correct. Okay, go ahead and take a picture if you haven't yet. Cool. All right, so yes, we have just finished the lecture material that will be covered on this weekend's exam. Okay. Are there any questions before we move to touch, which will be a topic covered on the final exam? Anything? No? All right, no problem. Let's go on here and share our screen. And in order to talk about touch, I am going to introduce you to a really interesting gentleman who I interviewed named John Bramblett. Now, I've got a little video to show you on John, which will help explain who he is, what he does. But John was a blind individual who lost his sight in his late teens and early 20s. He had a type of seizure disorder that actually did damage to his visual areas and some of the connections to his visual areas of the brain. He had the seizure problem all his life, but it then did some permanent damage, so he did lose his sight. And it was, as you can imagine, a very difficult thing for him. And one of the ways, surprisingly, that he decided to kind of address this in his life was to start to paint. He had never painted before, except like in art class when he was in elementary school or whatever, like what we all do. But he had never painted before seriously. His mom's a hobbyist. His mom's a painter by hobby, and according to him, is talented. But he had never done this. He had never followed it, had no interest in doing it. He's also a musician and was much more interested in becoming a musician. But he decided after he went blind, he wanted to try to paint, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. Now he had a 20 years, or I suppose a little less than that, to have a life of some vision at least. So he had memories of how things look visually, and would paint from memory. But he also would paint from subjects like his friends, his dog. And to do so, obviously, he'd have to touch, the face of somebody, or his doggy, if he wanted to paint a portrait of his dog, and render it on canvas somehow. And you'll see his technique is really, really interesting, and is going to be relevant to a lot of things we'll be discussing with regard to our kind of perceptual superpowers when it comes to touch perception. John's going to be nice because John's example is nice because it also is going to allow us to get into a discussion of plasticity, because as John got better at painting and learned new techniques to allow him to paint more effectively and efficiently, there's no question his brain changed. I mean, I don't think there's been scanning done on John's brain in particular, but there's been lots of research done on the plasticity that comes from experience touching things. And we're going to use John's example to kind of guide us through some of that research, which is nice. But let's go ahead and introduce John first through a little video that I think you'll find interesting.
My sight went very slowly at first. I didn't even realize it when I first noticed I was having trouble with my sight. I was already really twice over the legal limit for being blind. There were just less and less things I could do. I couldn't go out as much, or if I did, I needed assistance. There were just so many things I couldn't do. I just had a lot of anger building up. And I didn't even realize. I didn't even realize I was that angry, but I started painting. I don't know, so much as an outlet or a way of defiance in a way. It's something that is viewed as very visual. After a while, I started becoming less and less angry. The more I painted, the more I could let that out, and to where now it just I have to paint. You know, starting painting was sort of a crazy thing in a way. I mean, but I decided I just was going to do it. I couldn't write. You know, I didn't have a computer at the time that could read to me. I feel like if I didn't have some sort of creative outlet, I was going to go crazy. I just needed to put something out there. In a way, it was out of anger. I mean, it was a way of, I don't know, like giving the middle finger to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. You know, saying, well, I may not be visual, but I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to try. And I really didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it was visually appealing. I just wanted to do it. I thought the physical action of painting, of putting what's in my mind out there, actually in the physical world, even if no one else liked it, I wanted to create something like that. That's really what got me into it. And I went and got some oil paints and just started. I told my mom that I started painting, and she was like, "Oh, that's great." She was so worried when her and my dad came over one day, and she wanted to be so supportive. You know, she didn't want to let me down, but she was so relieved when she looked at it. She liked it, and she actually liked it. The reason I lost my vision is I have a seizure disorder. I've had it ever since I was a kid. The seizure will start in the front, and it'll hit the back where the occipital lobe is, because you actually see back here. The optic nerve travels from your eyes around to the very back, so that my eyes work. I get light in, but the brain, the part that deciphers the image, doesn't know what to make with it. So it's sort of like a TV that you have on, but there's no signal. There's no antenna or cable or anything attached. So it's just it's just snow. It's just from the seizures, which is rare. It turns out. So, but if you have enough of them, you know, it'll do it. The main problem when doing a painting, if you can't see it visually, is keeping oriented on the canvas and knowing exactly where you are and what you've done. I've always drawn using pencils or pens, but you can't feel pencils or pen strokes once you put them down. And so I started using Elmer's glue because it dries and it's hard, but Elmer's glue takes about a day to dry. So whenever you make one line, you've got to wait about a day to go back and fill it again. So then I started using whiteout, the whiteout pen, and that makes a very nice line that you can fill. But if you paint it on canvas, over time it seeps into the canvas, so your drawing will disappear. And now I used this stuff called slick paint, and it dries really, really fast. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, and you can fill it. And it orients you to the painting, and that's really all you need. That's all a person's eyes do whenever they're painting. Probably the next hardest thing was colors, but with oil paint, the great thing about oil paints is that they're all made with different substances, and it gives them a different viscosity and a different texture. The white, it almost feels like caulk or toothpaste. It's very thick, very, very viscous. And black is almost runny. It still has a thickness to it, but compared to white, it's almost like oil. If you were to mix half white and half black, the filling and the viscosity is somewhere halfway in between. So you can just start working from there. Sometimes I'll decide on a color just because I like the way it feels. When I first started, I painted very, very slowly. I would make a small sketch and it would take me 8 hours to make one little sketch. I've sped up quite a bit. And part of it is just I can remember a lot more. Like whenever my hand goes over the drawing, I can feel the lines, and then I remember where they are, and then my other, over time I've learned to follow it a little bit more exact. One hand sort of to see the canvas, and the other hand to fill in the paint. It's hard to tell sometimes when you have a lot going on in a painting if it's actually working or if the colors are very good. It's nice to have an artist to go talk to, someone that you can talk to that you can say, is this actually the color that I was going for? And them to be able to say yes or it is or not. Does it work? Is this composition? Can you see what I'm kind of getting at here? And so the input's just invaluable.
It kind of like gives it like a circular, like the tracks direct the eye and it goes down like that. So you've already, I mean, I wouldn't move it. That's just me.
Yeah, you're probably right, 'cause I have the clouds going off on the left.
Okay, I think that's great. That's enough, I think. As you can see, he's really learned a lot of interesting techniques to allow him to paint, and his paintings are really something. I mean, you're seeing some right there. He's doing really well. I've been in touch with him, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and he's written a book that I have. He's making money off of his paintings. He teaches painting, both to the blind, and also they have him come in and lecture to regular art schools of sighted individuals, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But that was his wife you just saw there, and they have, I think, 2 children now, and he's doing wonderfully. He's doing great. I mean, in the beginning, it's there was a lot of videos done of him and stuff like that. Now, I mean, the novelty's kind of worn off a little bit, and now he's just considered a very, successful painter and able to support his family and do well. So anyway, this is John. If you have any questions about him or how he's able to do things or anything about his life, I'd be happy to answer. So he really, I guess, officially lost all of his sight when he was around 25, and he had, as I said, very little painting experience, but because his mom had been a painter, and for whatever reason, he decided to try something that I guess everyone else thought would be nearly impossible for him, and he was able to do it, which is terrific. You saw a little bit about his technique, and I think this is really where it gets most relevant to our discussion of touch and plasticity, how the brain changes with experience of touch, which we'll be spending most of our first chapter on touch discussing. His technique involves drawing an outline. First, he does it on a piece of paper, and then he does it on a canvas, and he uses a type of paint called puffy paint. It's got other names, but some of you might have used this. I guess it's really good for fabric, like if you're painting on the back of a jean jacket or on jeans or something like that. It's a really good paint to use, but it leaves a little bit of a raised line, which is absolutely critical for him, because he needs to be able to feel that raised line, to feel the outlines of his subjects, and then to be able to paint in between the outlines so he can fill in the colors. It also dries very quickly. He mentioned there that he had tried a couple of other things that didn't work particularly well, but settled on this puffy paint, which has worked really wonderfully for him. And so as he's painting, at least initially, I'm going to talk a little bit about how he's been able to kind of streamline his process, but at least initially what he would end up doing is feeling the outlines on the canvas that he did with puffy paint with his left hand, and then with his right hand he would kind of paint between the outlines. He's feeling the outlines, like, okay, this part here I'm going to paint say a light blue or something like that, and kind of continue to feel and paint that way. So he follows the lines with his left hand as he's kind of using the brush to paint in between the lines that's in his right hand, okay, filling the spaces with the paint. Now, what he said about oil paint is absolutely critical for him. So if you've done any painting, just casually for fun, into your later teenage years, whatever, you might know a little bit about oil versus acrylic paint. So acrylic paint is usually the paint of choice these days if you're painting on canvas, because it dries faster, it's a lot less messy, it's cheaper. For John, though, he has to use oil paint. And the reason he does is exactly what he said there in the video, that oil paints are made of different chemicals, different materials. And that allows oil paints of different colors to have different textures, right? So he said that the white, as he feels it with his fingers, feels pastier, kind of feels like a toothpaste or something like that, where the black feels more like an oil, like it's slick, it's more runny, I think is the term he used. So he's able to determine what color he's working with based on that. He can stick his fingers in it. But maybe even more importantly, because you can imagine, I'm sure he does this, he probably lines up, all the different colors bottles in a certain order, so he remembers where these things are. Maybe he has Braille on them or something as well. But as a painter, he's got to be able to mix colors too. He wants different shades of blue, not just the blue that's in the bottle and all that sort of thing. So what he'll do is, in order to get different shades, is mix the paints just like any artist would, and he uses a palette to do that. And in order to have a sense of what the mixed color might be, he'll use his fingers to feel, how pasty, how slippery, how gooky, or whatever other terms you want to use for the feel of a paint might be. So, as he said, if he wants to make a gray, he'll take some white, he'll take some black, he'll mix them together, and then he'll feel that mixture. And he'll know if it's a gray that's maybe a little closer to white, or if it's a gray that's a little closer to black. And he'll have a good sense of what that's ultimately going to look like to people as he applies it to the canvas, right? So it has to be oil paint, because that's the type of paint that's tactily distinct. Acrylics, I guess, are all pretty much made of the same material, the same chemical composition, and don't have that distinctiveness in terms of how they feel as he's touching them. So it allows for paint mixing through touch, as I said. Now, I also said that he's able to feel those raised lines through the non-brush hands as he's going around. But, and this is interesting, when that video was done, he had just pretty much started. When I interviewed him, he had more expertise. And now he has probably so much more since when I interviewed him, but he had learned ways to make it more efficient, and the ways he's made it more efficient are interesting and will have implications for what we're going to discuss when we discuss the details of touch. What he's able to do now, when it comes through, when it comes to things like determining the color mixture, is he won't have to touch the mixed paint with his fingers anymore. He'll be able to determine that by how the brush is resistant as he kind of pulls the brush through the paint, right? So the brush has, these little fibers on the end. And if it's, say, a more light gray, so it's got more thick white paint than it has the thin black paint in it, as he pulls his brush across that now mixed paint, the resistance that the paint gives the brush will tell him if that's a lighter gray or a darker gray. So he doesn't need to actually touch the paints anymore like this, which is terrific. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He doesn't have to slow down and wipe his hands and all that sort of stuff. And it's faster because he's got the brush in his right hand anyway. He doesn't have to put the brush down. So he'll just be able to feel the brush's resistance based on how the paint is either thicker or thinner, which is really pretty cool. So these days he can determine mixtures with resistance. And he also doesn't really have to touch the lines that much anymore on the painting itself, those raised puffy paint lines. As you saw him do, he used to touch the lines and then paint in between them. But now he knows the lines are there, again, by how the brush is resisted based on those lines. So, the lines are pretty small, but, as you're kind of gently moving the brush back and forth, you could imagine that, there'll be like a little catch as you're moving the brush and say, oh, that's where the line is. That's where the line is. So he doesn't need to touch it with his left hand. He can do other things with the left hand. He can balance himself. He can, prepare something else, maybe hold the paint or something like that with his left hand. And he can tell where the lines are just with his right hand that's holding the brush. Okay, so he can determine the raised lines with the brush as well. So basically what he's doing here is he's using a tool to touch the paint and a tool to touch the painting and the raised lines of the painting to be able to perform his painting task now. This is a type of touch we're going to talk about later, this idea of using tools to touch things that I'm going to call a proxy touch. It just means you're using a proxy to touch things. But as you'll see, our ability to use tools, okay, can you see this? This is a little remote control. But whether we're talking about using a stylus on our computer screens, or a pen on paper, or mixing soup using a wooden spoon, or just using silverware, are all examples of using tools to touch things. And our ability to do that is absolutely astonishing. And certainly for John Bramblett, it is just breathtaking how he can use a brush to determine the color of something. It's just amazing, based on its viscosity, in other words. So he paints from memory and from models, as I said. So he said that this is his old church up here that he remembers from before he lost his sight. Here's his doggy face that he painted. Here's a friend's face that he painted by touching it. So he'd have the friend come in and sit down, and he'd wash his hands carefully, and then maybe use his little rubber gloves or something, and then touch the face of the person, and then he would paint based on that. And he'd say something interesting. He'd say that actually, when it came to touching things, he believed that there were things that he was actually able to determine and feel from the touching rather than just looking at the subjects. And so, for example, he would say, touch his friend's face. And, if you touch your own face, I'm sure you're aware of this, there's, the texture of your face is different in different regions of your face, right? And maybe, like around your nose, it's a little bit more oily, maybe down on the cheeks, it's a little bit more dry. And he would use that sometimes to choose the paints he's going to select to render that part of a person's face, right? So around here, I think that's probably what he did here, maybe. Around here, these are more oily parts of a person's face. Up here, it's a little bit more dry. And he then chooses, he knows this is actually an exaggeration, or there's going to be something a little bit more unrealistic about how things look, but he wants the paintings to be interesting. He doesn't want it to, look like a photograph of the person. He wants to kind of stylize things. Maybe in these cases, they look almost psychedelic, I think, right? And so he'll say, okay, well, the person is oily around here, so I'm going to use one of the paints that feels a little bit more oily to me. I'm going to use a color that to me feels a little bit more oily. Over here, the person's face is a little drier. I'm going to use a paint that's not as oily, that's maybe, a little bit thicker. And so he'll, he's very aware that that's not going to look that realistic, right? He's got other things to make it recognizable, like the shapes of the eyes and that sort of thing. But it's an interesting kind of motivation. So he believes that in some ways, touching a subject that you're going to paint provides more detail. He said, imagine you're going to paint a chair. That's going to be part of your subject in this next painting. And you look at it, if you're visual, and you can see, and you look at it, and there's certain things you can see. But then imagine now, after you've looked at it, you go in and you touch it. And imagine as you maybe close your eyes as you touch it, you kind of bring your hands around the wood. You maybe can feel where the wood is bolted together with screws or something like that. You can feel there's a roughness to where the seat is, and that's going to affect how you paint something, right? And so he said he kind of makes an interesting argument for that, I think. So this is where we get to his teaching. As I said, he's taught painting to both blind and sighted students. Blind students, typically it's kids that come in, and he teaches this technique, and they have a great time, and the parents learn how this is done, and it's a lot of fun. But they hire him sometimes to give talks and maybe teach a few seminars in regular art schools, filled with sighted painters. And what he'll do, he'll do some demonstrations that I think are pretty profound for painting. Similar to what I just said about touching the chair and feeling more, touching a face and feeling more. What he'll do is he'll bring in an apple, kind of one of the standard things people learn to paint when they're in art school, I suppose. And he'll put it in the middle of the room and say, okay, everybody, stand at your easels and paint this apple. I say, okay, fine. I've probably done this tons of times before, but they will do that fairly quickly, right? And then he'll say, okay, everyone, look at each other's paintings and tell me how much variation is it from one to the other. And they'll say, all these paintings kind of just look like an apple. Yeah, people are on different sides of the apple, but besides that, they're apples. Okay, that's what an apple looks like. That's how these people painted it, right? Then he'll say, okay, everybody, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the same apple, and I want you to tear off the painting you just made. Here's a new chance to make an apple again, but this time I want you to paint it not based on how it looks, but how it feels. So he'll say, close your eyes, and we're going to pass the apple around, and I want you to take a good 60 seconds and really feel the apple, because that's the apple I want you to paint. Okay, so this is kind of an apple painting kind of touch technique, right? Kind of interesting. And so they'll do this. They'll take it very seriously. They go, okay. They'll touch the apple. They'll feel the stem. They'll feel the curvature of the apple, the indentations, the bottom, all that stuff, and they'll pass it down. And they'll start painting. And they can open their eyes when it comes time to paint. So they'll paint, and everyone will do this. They'll say, okay, now that you're all done, let's compare paintings now. And it will be the case that all the paintings look so different from each other, which is just so interesting, right? When you are touching something, your interpretation kind of becomes so much more multidimensional, right? There's so many different things you can touch in an apple that maybe when you're looking at an apple are harder to really apprehend. So he makes this really interesting argument for painting not just being a visual medium, but kind of a touch medium as well, that touching your subjects are really going to give you a different perspective on how you will then render them on the canvas, which is really interesting. Continuing in this vein, you can see, those of you that are a little familiar with art, you might know that those bottom three paintings are not John Bramblett paintings on this slide, right? You might know that the left one is Cézanne, the middle one is Rembrandt, the right one is Van Gogh. And yeah, if you don't know that, that's fine. If you haven't taken an art class yet, or you're not gonna, when you travel, you're gonna learn this a little bit, because those are three very famous artists. You'll learn differences, you'll learn a little about the history. It's great. He was lucky enough, after he became a little famous, being on TV and that sort of thing, to be invited to the homes of big time art collectors, very, very wealthy art collectors. And what they would do is they'd have him come in and they describe the painting. They say, this is actually a Cézanne that we were able to buy. That's we're going to eventually contribute to a museum, but it's home for now. It's home for the next few years. So we thought you'd enjoy touching the painting, which is clearly not something you can do in a museum. They will not let you touch a painting in a museum. But while it's at a person's home, it's their painting, and they can do that. They paid for it. So they have him probably put on rubber gloves, so they didn't. The oil on his skin didn't do any damage to it. These are really expensive paintings, but he was able to touch paintings of Cézanne, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh. And he said it was a fascinating experience. Now, he knew he had taken an art class or two, art appreciation class or two when he was younger. So he knew kind of generally what style that these painters would have before, he lost his vision completely. But he says it's so different when you're touching it. And so he put on the rubber gloves and he started touching the paintings, the various forms of the paintings. And go from painting to painting and try to feel differences in the actual brush stroke style of these different painters, right? And you look at this and you can really kind of get a sense just from vision that the brush strokes are different in a Van Gogh, right? I mean, look at these brush strokes are almost kind of violent, they're kind of very aggressive. where to get these lighting shades in Rembrandt, the brushstrokes are a little smoother, a little bit more languid, right? And here too, you know, there are some kind of more smooth brushstrokes, but there's also, you know, kind of like a little bit more detail in the reproduction of the skin here, you know, the different kind of splotches and things like that. And he said he could feel this. You know, he would feel the brushstrokes and how the artist from so long ago was using brushstrokes to render different parts of a painting and to render different paintings. And, you know, and he would say like it was almost like a time machine, you know, like he could feel like Van Gogh's kind of, I don't know, approach to the painting, the tension he felt in the painting as he was painting, you know, maybe the mood he was in when he, you know, kind of really went after the canvas with those brushstrokes. You know, it kind of almost brought him back to the time and place that Van Gogh painted this, and Rembrandt painted this, and Cezanne painted this one. Which is absolutely fascinating if you think of it, right? That, you know, when you look at a painting, you look about the place that's being portrayed, you know, you maybe know a little bit about the history and how different kind of styles kind of, you know, went from one into the other and actually that sort of thing. But to actually get close enough up and to touch the way the brush hit the canvas when the painting was made hundreds of years ago, has got to be a pretty profound thing. And again, he really kind of makes this argument for painting not just being a visual medium, but something that can be kind of appreciated from touch as well. Now, don't say Rosenblum said I can come to this museum and touch paintings. Don't do that. They won't let you do that. But, you know, when you look at paintings, especially in a live setting, don't be afraid to get close and look to see, you know, something of how the brush strokes were actually used to create the painting. And it kind of brings you back into the mind of the painter potentially as they were creating the painting, which is a really very intimate place to be as you're, you know, looking at a painting in an art museum. It's kind of interesting. All right, any questions about John Bramblett before we continue here? You know, actually, you know what we're going to do? We only got 10 minutes left. Let's just do our last polling question of the day, and then we'll finish a little bit early today because the next slide is a little meaty. We're going to start talking about what happens with the brain with blindness and when it comes to touch and how plasticity occurs. That's a little meaty right before your midterm exam, and it's not on the midterm exam. That's okay. Let's do your polling question instead. So this will be the last question you'll get for your exam. This will be on your midterm exam. Hopefully you'll find it relatively easy. Yeah, wine tasting. Which of the following is true of wine experts? A, they have a better taste threshold for wine. B, they have better taste discrimination for wine. C, they have enhanced activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine. Or D, all of the above. And if you're unsure, go back and look at the slide. The answer is right there. A couple of slides, maybe when we were first talking about wine experts, somewhere around there. But you should be able to answer this. Give you another 10 seconds or so. Oh, looks like all of you answered. Good. Well, we'll stop here then. No problem. Okay, maybe this was a little trickier than I realized, but your answer is right there. The correct answer is, in fact, C. Now, if you look back on your slide, you'll see that they don't have better thresholds for tasting wine, which means, and here's the example you can think of for the answer of A. If you put a drop or two of wine in a glass of water and then had people determine whether that glass of water had wine flavor in it, a master sommelier, an expert, is not able to do that any better than novices, not better than you and me. And that's also true if you put, you have 2 glasses of wine there and you put a little bit of a different type of wine in one or the other and ask for which is which. They can't even tell the difference. They'll say, I think these are absolutely the same. Okay, so that's what we're talking about there is taste threshold. That's the answer A, which means it's incorrect. And taste discrimination. They are no better than you and me. Stephen Poe is no better than you and me at taste thresholds and taste discrimination. What they are better with, or what they have enhancement in, is activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine. They also show greater left hemisphere activity. They show greater activity in areas of smell and taste integration, but that is one of the things that we pointed out. They have more enhanced activity in their brain areas that have to do with memory and language. Language and memory, as it says there. So the correct answer is C. D is incorrect because A and B are incorrect. Okay, take a picture of that. That will be a question on your exam this weekend. And good, I'll stop sharing here. All right, so the exam will be available to you midnight tonight, up through midnight on Sunday. Good luck. Are there any last minute questions before we end for today? Anything? Cool. All right. Good luck on the exam, everybody. I think you'll do really well. Just don't forget to study. You have to study. You can't just do it open book without the studying. All right. See you next week.